Hey, what's going on, APUSH peeps? Video number 7 for you today. This is a good one. It's on the Atlantic economy and European interactions with Native Americans. This is Key Concept 2.1, Roman numeral 3, letters A through C. You know what time it is. It is shout out time. I want to give a huge shout out to Mr. Peterson's class in San Antonio, Texas. Thank you all for watching and good luck this year. Okay, so let's start off with the Atlantic economy. And this is trade between Europe, Africa, and the Americas on the Atlantic Ocean. And goods, people, ideas were exchanged between these three areas. Enslaved Africans and natives were also exchanged. Natives often were sent to the West Indies, and most slaves from Africans were sent to the West Indies or Brazil. If you take a look at this map, slaves came over on the Middle Passage. Raw goods were going from the Americas to Europe, and then manufactured goods were coming back from Europe to the Americas. So this is part of the Atlantic trade, or triangular trade, and even a part of mercantilism, with raw goods going over to Europe and then manufactured goods coming back. In the Middle Passage was a forced journey of African slaves from Africa to the Americas. They would be packed in as tightly as possible on a ship, sometimes having as little as 18 inches between themselves and the next person. They would be chained to each other, and as many as 20% of the people died on this forced journey. Just the absolute most horrific conditions you can possibly imagine on a ship for several weeks. And the colonies are going to focus on acquiring commodities that were valuable in Europe. Pay very close attention to this phrase. This is very important. Things like fur trade and tobacco are going to be very valuable in Europe, and the colonies are going to produce these. And they would also produce tobacco in places like the Chesapeake. And in the southern Atlantic colonies in the West Indies, sugar would be produced and sent over to Europe as well. And the Americans are going to focus on gaining new sources of labor. We'll see a huge increase in the African slave trade after 1676. That's the same year as Bacon's Rebellion, if you remember, and African slavery is just going to drastically increase after those years. Okay, so what are impacts of trade on native communities? Well, contact and trade with the Europeans drastically impacted native communities. You have things like the introduction of guns. There's cultural exchanges between the two groups, and Europeans are going to seek to assimilate natives into their societies, especially the Spanish. And assimilate means you're bringing somebody into your culture. And natives were sold into slavery in the West Indies, into areas where they did not know the land as well. And guns and horses made tribes more powerful, as we've talked about in several videos. There are economic exchanges as well. Lots of Native American land that is lost as plantations are going to spread further west. And demographically, one thing we've mentioned several times is the spread of epidemic diseases. This will drastically decrease native populations, things like smallpox and measles. So if you're writing any essay about Native Americans during colonial times, you should absolutely refer to the destructive nature of epidemic diseases and the impacts on the loss of life for natives. So interactions between the two groups, that's Europeans and natives, will foster, and that means to promote the growth of accommodation and conflict. Now we're going to talk about the next two conflicts in more detail in the next video, but to give you a preview, Spain became more accommodating to natives after the Pueblo Revolt. The Pueblo Revolt was a revolt in the southwestern portion of the United States, present-day United States, and Spain became much more accommodating afterwards. They allowed the natives to practice their religion more than they did before. Now, the British colonies, they will have conflict with natives over land. An example of this, again, we'll talk about more in the next video, is Metacom's War, also known as King Philip's War. And really, native resistance will decrease in New England after this war. Many of these natives were killed or sold into slavery in the West Indies after they lost this war. Now, native tribes will seek alliances with Europeans against other American Indian groups. An example of this is the Pequot War. And this is where colonists from Massachusetts and Connecticut, they allied with the Narragansett Native Americans against another tribe, the Pequots. And they actually surrounded the village that the Pequots were living in and killed almost everybody in there. And many of these Pequots were killed, including women and children. And others, the survivors, were really sold into slavery again in the West Indies. All right, let's do a quick recap. Impact of the Atlantic trade on Africa, Europe, and the Americas. How to trade with Europe impact Native Americans. Definitely know that. And be able to identify and explain a conflict between natives and Europeans. The Pueblo Revolt and Metacom's War. Absolutely know those two. They're specifically mentioned in the curriculum, and we'll get to them in the next video. And then the Pequot War as well. All right, look forward to seeing you back here for video number 8. This is Goals and Interests of Colonists, Metacom's War, and the Pueblo Revolt. Thanks for watching, and best of luck on all your tests. Have a good day.